one of my favorite words in culture talk is contextualization, because I believe it's one of the most important things that we can talk about when we talk about communication. There was a brand designer by the name of Chris Do, and in one of his YouTube videos, he asked somebody a question around college and they didn't know how to answer it. And he said, okay, that's my fault as the communicator because I'm the one who asked you the question and I didn't give it to you a way where you felt comfortable to respond. He didn't say the question was wrong, right? He just said, this wasn't the question for you to engage in the way that we need. I'm looking at the effect of what I'm doing, not the intention of what I'm doing. Right. And when we talk about communicating, and one of our biggest core goals is alignment. We want everybody to kind of get into alignment. And that doesn't mean a single file line, right? We want the leaders to have a shared perspective, the employees to have a shared perspective, the customers to have a shared perspective, and all of those to be able to feed into each other from a place of understanding.
Welcome to Narratives Leadership Story Talks, where great leaders go beyond the bottom line to create lasting impact. Join hosts Jerome Deroy and Julienne Ryan as they uncover the stories behind real-world challenges, offering practical insights to help you lead with empathy, authenticity, and purpose. Each episode dives into how leaders use storytelling to build trust, foster connection, and inspire action. Whether you're navigating workplace dynamics, driving change, or building high-performing teams.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome Deroy, CEO of Narrative.
I'm Julienne Ryan, and I'm delighted to be here with you doing another podcast.
I know, it's great to see you again. And before we move on to introducing our guest, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review wherever you find your podcasts, and also check out our YouTube channel, where this episode will be hosted as well. And you can always go to narrative.com, narrative.com/podcast, where you will find our archive of more than 140 episodes at this point. And yes, I hope you enjoy all of that. So thanks for being here. I want to, without further ado, introduce our guest, Evante Daniels, founder of Seeqer, a company that builds futuristic systems to help leaders understand how culture moves through their organizations. He works with schools, governments, and businesses to spot problems early, fix miscommunication, and build stronger teams. His work is based on something he calls cultural physics, a way to track how people's shared beliefs and stories shape the systems they're part of. Evante helps leaders make better decisions by showing them what's really going on underneath. So as our longtime listeners can tell, Evante fits right into the show, and I'm so happy that you're here. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. How cool and niche is that? I mean, that you had us at the first sentence about physics and culture, and you're like, so yes, we're excited.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so true. I mean, these are that's definitely what I was what I'm kind of intending for in this interview is that, there's so many boxes that are checked in terms of what our listeners are interested in, and culture is such a big one. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I want to start with a question that we ask of all of our guests. So we'll do the same with you, which is, what's an experience that you could tell us about that has shaped who you are today, still continues to influence you or inform your work maybe in some form?
There are so many. That's like the hard part, is always choosing the one that best encapsulates it. But I grew up as a church kid in Atlanta, and it's where I first learned production. And my first PA job was working a soundboard for a Black church of like 6,500 people. And so one of the first memories I have was reaching over to touch the sound. I was like 10 years old, had no idea what I was doing, didn't know what the buttons or the levers were. And there was a guy in front of the board. He was just banging around and enjoying the music, and he was in the moment, he was vibing, just totally locked into the flow. And I reached over to try to touch one of the knobs, and he slapped my hand so loudly that 3 pews behind me, someone went, "Oh my goodness." But I think that was the first time I actually got to learn about the mechanics behind a moment, because he was like, we're really enjoying what's happening right now. I'm creating this atmosphere. Don't you dare mess it up. I had no idea, but I think from 10 years old forward, that has led me to where I am.
Oh, amazing. That's great.
I hope this podcast finds this guy. You just put it out there, put it out an intention to the church, and just say wherever you are, that would be great. Teachable moment, just traveling. Yes, that would be awesome.
Oh my goodness, that would be great. Shout out to the homie.
That's right. Well, so it's interesting because the one of the questions I was thinking about before coming onto this interview was, you were mentioning the different buttons and knobs and all those things, and I know that you talk about culture. You have this analogy of like a river and levees, and I was wondering if you could walk us through how you see an organization, and how some organizations sort of withstand floods or whatever's going on, or and how some just break under these cultural pressures. So yeah,
Yeah.
I know there's a lot in that question, but I'd love to hear more about that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I love the river analogy. I think it's the easiest thing for a lot of us to wrap our minds around. I lived in Louisiana for 8 years, so it comes from looking at the Mississippi and the levees in New Orleans. But when we think about storms, we think about water and currents and how things flow, right? There's a trickle down process where far up north, all of these deltas and tributaries come together to form the Mississippi River. And that has a current to it, has a flow. It flows in a certain direction at a certain rate. And, depending on how much water is there or what's happening in the season, that rate may increase, right? We've seen times where there's flash flood warnings because, there's a storm surge of water coming through. And then there are other times where it's not so strong. And maybe it's a drought and it's just a trickle, but it's still coming forward, right? It's still making its way down. And so when I look at culture, that's how I see us as people, is that we're part of this current together. And based off of what we're talking about, based off of what's happening around us, it's shaping how we show up and how we're moving through these spaces. And then that brings us to the organization, right? Which I always look to as the levee. It helps to shape where culture is going. When we look at news or businesses or where we just spend our time every day, that shapes our perspective. And businesses aren't organic things. They're not human beings. They don't feel the way that we do, right? This isn't a weird metaphor to go into that direction. They're as stationary as businesses are. And as hard as it is to reconstruct the business, is as hard as it is to reconstruct the levee, right? And there's a lot of things that are impacted by that levee being there. And for a lot of those reasons, it's to maintain the flow of the water. And so when we talk about the phrase cultural resilience, which is one of my favorite words to bring up, it's really talking about the strength of the levee and saying, how strong are you against the waves of culture? Understanding that we may have hurricanes, we may have droughts, we may have flash flood seasons, but regardless, your business, your organization is going to be there. And how much of a battering can it take before there is structural damage? And so when we talk about culture from this lens, I know it's throwing a whole different way to look at it. But really, what we're seeing is there's a collective force of us having opinions, of us sharing perspective, of sharing values. And as that changes over time, that influences the things around us in everyday life. And things that aren't prepared to deal with it, they start to erode just like levees do.
I know this is lighting up in your head too, the analogies. We it's such a great testimony to the work you're doing, but also to the power of storytelling, because we often talk about metaphors and analogies or stories cousins, and you're making it relatable. You're finding that connecting piece that everyone can relate to no matter what, and the fact that that's the land that's maybe surrounding it, but it's an analogy. And I know Jerome is going to talk about the shape of listening and how it changes in our story work. In the narrative methodology, they came up with it. Our listening is shaped by our audience or the people with us. You don't tell a story twice. So we make the analogy that our listening in the room is like pouring water into a glass. It gets shaped, the glass and the shape, whatever you're pouring the liquid into, takes the shape of that conversation. So it is a great example for us to think about. So tell us more, as we say in Storytell. What else can we be learning about from you? You're talking about cultural intelligence and all these things, but lead us on. We'll follow.
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, if we understand that if we look at physics as this river and we're going to follow that analogy, uh, cultural physics is understanding the mechanics of how that river flows and the impact it has on organizations, institutions, and people, right? And it's really taking a look at the whole field together and saying there are a lot of dominoes in effect. There are a lot of things that are working here, but it's not just a loose kind of emotional. It pops up out of thin air. We're like, well, these pieces come from perception or come from values that come from talking points and come from moments, and so we're essentially going back through what knocked the first domino over. And when we talk about culture, when we talk about cultural physics, there are a lot of things that shape how we see each other, right? And that's the base of cultural physics. It's to acknowledge that. It's to say that, my background growing up as a kid in Atlanta, it's going to give me a very different perspective than someone who lives in San Francisco or is from San Francisco, even if we lived in the same building. It's that we're coming from very different areas, and there's some collective overtimes there that bring us all together, and that's really the important part. But also understanding there are some differences, and there are some pieces that shape our perception as human beings, that shape how we see ourselves and how we see others.
Well, the thing that I was just thinking about, Evante, was kind of the how do you how do you guide organizations to, and or if this is part of what you do, but like, is there a part of your work that's about anticipating these cultural forces? Is it about sort of noting, I don't know what to call it, other than vulnerabilities that an organization might have, like the levee is starting to erode over here, we should probably pay attention to that, and that's because of that particular cultural force that we've been facing the last 5 years, whatever it is. I'm wondering if there's like a you know something, without naming names, but a more of an example of how you sort of address these cultural forces. Is it about anticipation? Is it about fixing? Like, how does that all work for you?
Well, this is it. This is a new field for a lot of people coming into the space. They haven't looked at culture like this. And so a lot of our work is putting out fires. Wow, I love to get to the preventative care side of all of this, and maybe one day we'll be able to, but we're in a health crisis. And so every organization we're coming across has cultural issues as expected, right? This hasn't been a priority in business school or in frameworks that came from different business reviews. It's not something that's popped up like that. And so when things aren't acknowledged, regardless if we believe they exist or not, they end up having effects over time. And so a lot of times we're coming into organizations and we're saying, what's going on? Just talk to us. Let's understand where everybody's at right now, and let's get a good layout of the field. We essentially are coming in and building topography for a lot of these organizations. And then we're able to say, yo, okay, so this is a black hole. This is a problem. Now that you understand the layout of where everything is and you understand how volatile your environment is, which is a huge question for us, right? Then now we can start talking about solving solutions. And so it's kind of a mix. I love solving problems. I always joked when I was in marketing that there are two kinds of marketers. There are the marketers who love the emergency room, and then there are the marketers who love the surgical suite. I love the emergency room. Put me in a crisis all day long, I'm going to have a blast. But I have to understand what cultural intelligence is. The hope of this work, and as we're sharing and we talk about cultural physics, is that we will see culturally resilient organizations and that we will celebrate those that already are and even learn from them. And so it's an interesting role because part of it is teaching, right? Part of it is sharing what we call cultural physics, the mechanics around it. Another part of it is teaching leaders how to be culturally intelligent, how to be aware of how culture moves, of the things that they are dealing with on a regular basis. And then beyond that, it's to address cultural pitfalls. When we measure cultural resilience in an organization, it's one of the things that Seeqer does. We have an intelligence model that we're able to quantify strength over a couple of different areas. And essentially, we look at leadership stability. We look at if their workforce is aligned with upcoming generational values. We look at how their brand and narrative are running in that industry. We look at their marketing performance and their stakeholder trust. And we look at their crisis management. And so we grade them on all of those pieces. plus what's happening outside of the levee, right? And out of that, we're able to say, okay, so your score is a C, or your score is a B, or congratulations, your score is an A. There's still work to do, because at the same time, culture always moves forward, and I think that's a really important thing for people to remember as they're talking about culture, is that there's no such thing as staying on the bleeding edge of it as a company. As an individual, 13 to 17-year-olds are pretty good about being fresh about what's happening out and where stuff is coming. But after that, it's a catch up game. And so we, as much as we want to predict, we also have to kind of accept the same thing that quantum physicists accept, where they're like, the more that we learn, the less we understand. We can't, we're still trying to find the ratios that explain why this one TikTok hit the right levels of cognitive and nervous system communication to speak to a larger issue. And hopefully one day Seeqer will be able to share that knowledge with everybody else, but it's still very much a journey for us.
I wanted to share a word that came to mind that kind of was screening through my brain when you were talking about your example, where all the things you were measuring and then having discussion about, and it was grit. That's a conversation that takes some grit on both ends. You're inviting somebody in and they did what you asked them to do. They found all this information and you have choices. Do I tough it out and move forward, or do I say, well, thank you for coming, we now know this? And they want to not, groups can sometimes shut down and not want to take it to the next step. So tell us more about that.
I mean, it's super intimidating. I say it comes from a place, it takes a level of humility that you need in your leaders, right? Like, I'll read the reports and I'm like, gee, I don't know if I would send this to someone.
That's honest.
It is.
That's so honest. Nobody says that. That's so important. Thank you for owning that. It's a fear factor. I don't want to take somebody's tagline, but it is.
There is a fear factor. There's a reason that people don't like going to the doctor or don't like getting an MRI. Part of it is because of the noise of the MRI. Part of it is because of what they might find out. When we talk about our case studies, like we tested these models against Blockbuster, and we wanted to see if we could predict Blockbuster's collapse before the stock market did in 2007. And we saw it from a cultural level in 2004. When you have that level of insight, it is very uncomfortable for everybody involved, and it should be uncomfortable for you as well, because we're looking at things in a way that we haven't before, or we haven't articulated at that level. And so, there's been times where we just kind of sit and we think about the ethics of what we're doing, or the ramifications of companies having cultural resilience scores, or leaders having indexes around this stuff, or even just putting words to how we shape perception at a large scale. It's coming from that background, there's a lot of times where we just wonder if we should maybe go take a break and eat a burrito and not come back to this, or if we should keep going. But at the same time, we're seeing companies that are struggling with these issues time and time again. And more importantly, for us, we're seeing practitioners who have the answers to these challenges, and they're readily being ignored. And that's where the passion of our work comes from. As we talk about cultural physics, we talk about cultural intelligence. It's introducing language to what people already do. And so if there's a CHRO, if there's a programming director, if there's a head of inclusion and belonging or learning and development who has been preaching this from the rafters since day one, then it's our joy to come along and say, like, hey, we know you're right. Like, and let's help make that argument a little bit easier. Let's actually have the conversation that you want to have, not the argument about why you have to say I feel instead of having a KPI.
And that's great, because I sort of, what's coming to my mind as I'm hearing you, it's especially with the example of Blockbuster, for example, right? Like being able to predict that kind of collapse from a cultural point of view, 3 years before the stock market did. And I mean, that to me shows again, for us who believe in the power of culture and the power of intentionally and consciously building a culture within an organization that is responsive as opposed to reactive, and able to anticipate these things, and as opposed to only be putting out fires. That seems to me like it actually gives you as an organization a competitive edge, which is what every leader wants to hear. How am I going to edge out my competition? And that seems like, the way you just put it, seems to me like the selling point. It's kind of like, yeah, of course you need to be paying attention to that, but it's not that obvious, and I guess that's why we need more people like you, basically, to.
Well, and that's why we're inviting people into the work. We are the only country in America that is quantifying cultural resilience like this. And that is a terrifying thing to say. I wish I could celebrate and dance around with that piece of news, but it's not good news, right? We enjoy being in the work. It's fun being at the bleeding edge of something, but it's also extremely daunting and terrifying. And especially because we get to think about the repercussions of it. But more importantly, there are more businesses in the country than we can help. And when we talk about cultural resilience, this is why companies fail. This is why organizations struggle. This is why teams fall apart before it pops up on a P&L or a finance piece or an operations engagement score or something like that. It's going to be the culture. It's going to be because the way the CEO started the meeting. And that has been what it's always been. When you look back at those who really understood timing and good marketing or good products, is they understood culture and they understood their place in culture and how they could be a part of that. So it's daunting. We take it very seriously. We try to steward this as much as possible. We work to share as much of our knowledge that we're picking up and learning on, helping to shape the next round of culturally resilient, culturally intelligent leaders, so that eventually we can get to a conversation of cultural conservation and protecting the things that make us who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder, Evante, what are you seeing now that you feel organizations need to be prepared for, or to be better at, handling or responding to?
I think one of the biggest things that's going to be a challenge, and you'll hear this from leaders, especially in learning and development, is that they're dealing with a very short leadership bench at a lot of large organizations. And this speaks to two of those factors that we talked about earlier. One, it speaks to leadership stability. And two, it speaks to workplace alignment and generational alignment. If we don't have a lot of senior leaders because a good amount are retiring or hitting that place where they're beginning to do their own thing, and we don't have the leaders below who have been planned, trained, taught the succession plan, then there's a gap. And that's not a gap that impacts us today, which is why it doesn't get solved tomorrow. But in 5 or 6 years, when you're looking at why this plan was only 1 page long or why we didn't do the due diligence properly in this piece, it's because the leaders that we currently have haven't done succession plans. It's because they haven't passed on the knowledge. And that's a very different way of thinking. Let's be real. A lot of us grew up in the intellectual property zone. We understand building frameworks and writing books and how to do this stuff. And so the idea of actually intentionally training someone up for the stability of an organization, it's not how we talk about, succession. But this is a consistent issue. And then on top of that, because that bench is so short, they're pulling people from other organizations. They're pulling people who may not be culturally qualified to understand that your new workforce is not your old workforce, right? I talked about earlier that culture is really on the shoulders of 13 to 17-year-olds. Whatever they decide is cool, regardless of how we feel about it, that's what's cool right now. That's the conversation, that's the trend, that's the bop. And there's a signifier under it that says these are their values. This is what matters to them, right? A good thing is I grew up in the Hummer era, right? Like the big truck era. And bigger was better. That's what Carl's Jr. said. That's what Burger King said. That's what GMC said. Well, now we're dealing with a buyer's market that doesn't believe bigger is better because they grew up hearing about size and carbon footprints and having to downsize. They want something that works regardless of how big it is. How does that impact how you set up your office? How does that change how you do a conversation or a meeting or a conference if suddenly they don't care about production like that? They find it more impressionable to just sit on the floor in a room and have a conversation than go to a conference. And so that crux, right, of us not having senior leaders and that gap of not having leaders directly under them who can help means that within the next 5 to 10 years, across most organizations, you're going to see a cultural reckoning where the people who are leading it are not plugged into the culture and they're not listening to the people who are. And so tone deaf branding, which we're starting to see is popping up on social media, that people are tired of social media managers giving us the tongue in cheek account and the little sass and all of these things, it's starting to lose its flavor. And that's because the culture's changing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where there was a lot of talk about intergenerational collaboration and how I think it's 3 or 4 generations that are in the office at the same time right now, or in the workplace at the same time, and how everyone brings in their own background, as you've just said, right? You grew up in a certain era, I grew up in a certain, and then the people after us, have grown up in a different era as well, and now we're all in the same workplace trying to do the same work in the same direction, right? But not everybody's hearing things in the same way, and I wonder how much of that is part of your work as well, in turn, because you were talking about how to teach or teaching leaders how to live with that ambiguity and these things that are an ever-changing landscape. But what about that aspect of things, of all these different generations that have to coexist somehow?
One of my favorite words in culture talk is contextualization, because I believe it's one of the most important things that we can talk about when we talk about communication. There was a brand designer by the name of Chris Doe. And in one of his YouTube videos, he asked somebody a question around college and they didn't know how to answer it. And he said, okay, that's my fault as the communicator because I'm the one who asked you the question and I didn't give it to you a way where you felt comfortable to respond. He didn't say the question was wrong, right? He just said this wasn't the question for you to engage in the way that we need. I'm looking at the effect of what I'm doing, not the intention of what I'm doing. Right. And when we talk about communicating, and one of our biggest core goals is alignment. We want everybody to kind of get into alignment. And that doesn't mean a single file line, right? We want the leaders to have a shared perspective, the employees to have a shared perspective, the customers to have a shared perspective, and all of those to be able to feed into each other from a place of understanding. And what that takes is being able to develop a core message that can then be contextualized for your leaders. And this is usually the problem for most organizations when it comes to communication, when it comes to culture or HR work, is they'll talk about their goals, right? And the leader will write the goal. And it'll be written from a leader's perspective. And then somebody on the front line will receive this goal and go, what does this have to do with me? Why is this the thing? I don't understand. Why are we focused on this? Right? And they don't want to follow through. Why would they? That goal wasn't written for them. It was written for somebody who's making 7 times what they were making in a completely different office, in a completely different city, and maybe at a different point in life. Right. And so when we talk about cultural alignment, a lot of times it's not saying, okay, we wrote it this one time. We have to write it a million different ways and make sure that it's accurate and that it's honest, right? That we're communicating the same thing. And then we have to check the result of what we're saying. And so a lot of the work I do ends with me asking, does that make sense? Over and over and over again. And people go, why do you just keep saying, does that make sense? I'm like, because I can explain it to myself all day long. I can explain it to my client. But can I explain it to this person who needs to know that information?
Good storytelling brings the other part of the brain and wakens it up. So you've managed to unsuppress quite a number of situations where it was goals and performance management and this one system where my mantra as I worked with people was one size does not fit all, and trying to get context to connect the dots to everyone you mentioned, all the layers of the organization was challenging because somebody took a broad breaststroke and it was inspirational till you broke it down and were able to connect it. So I'm sure there's a lot of people out there going to be, yes.
And let's give credit to the leader where the leaders do. When you learn leadership skills, that's how you learn how to write, right? You learn how to do a high value bird's eye positioning of the situation. And that's just disregarding the people in the trees, And so for us, it's human-centered design, but in culture. We want to see how each person is going to receive something. How are they going to take it? And knowing that we're dealing with perception, right? The question doesn't come down, is it going to be a full bleed or not on the print, even though that's very important. You should always have an answer to that. It really comes down, if we put this poster up in the hallway, is someone going to roll their eyes at it or is someone going to appreciate it? 9 times out of 10, people roll their eyes at it. Maybe we should ask why, you know? And this is the truth of it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. You know I mean, there's a lot of links, and as Julienne observed, with storytelling and what we deal with, you know, on a day-to-day basis in our work, because context is everything for the story, right? So, and also the person who tells the story, whether their point of view is obvious or not in the content of the story, doesn't really matter, because you know, you just look at the person and you see a point of view, right? You make up a point of view in your mind, and then you hear the story, and either it affirms that point of view for you, or it actually surprises you, and it's like, oh, I didn't think that person would say that, you know, or went through that life experience, etc. And I'm curious from your point of view, Evante, about the role of storytelling in sort of, you know, bringing these cultural aspects, or you know, the values that an organization lives by, kind of bringing all that to life, and maybe even socializing these things. Is that something that you look at, the kinds of stories people tell and how they tell them?
Oh my goodness. All the time, only every day, every moment. Uh, so storytelling is the lifeblood for people from a cultural sense. And I always want to start there. I grew up with parents who were in the middle of the civil rights movement, who were from country beginnings, you know, one from a cattle farm, another one from a paper mill town. And so when I would visit my grandparents, storytelling was the way to be entertained as a kid. And you know, when you asked me that question about memories, the other memory that came to mind was sitting on my grandfather's front porch during the dog days of summer. For those not in the South, that's when it rains ridiculous amounts for 30 minutes and then it acts like it never did. Um, and he had the magic ability of being able to tell a story just long enough for the rainstorm. And so my grandmother would snap the green beans or snap peas, and he'd sit in his rocking chair and he'd tell me some convoluted, crazy grandfather story that only a grandfather could tell. And by the time we got to the end of it, the rain was gone. You can go out and play, and now you have this whole new world that you're going into. So, personally, for me, storytelling is a deep part of my life. It's how I tell, as you can tell, that's how I explain a lot of things, is through stories. And the cool thing with cultural physics is we explain why that's so important. Oration, the ability of talking, the benefit of a podcast is that we're really communicating at two different levels at once, right? We're communicating through our nervous systems and through our minds. The rhythm in which I speak in, my tone, all of these different things shape how your body is going to feel that. And the pauses that I may take before my words, or if I add more sauce onto a certain part of it, gives it a certain form of weight, right? And even in your body, you go, ooh, that's important. I don't know why, but it is, right? We see this in writing all the time with stories and foreshadowing. And we're like, I don't know what that person did, but they're the guilty one. I don't know why, but they are, right? We do this all the time. And so if we understand that we speak to our bodies first, right? If you want to get a kid's attention, you drop into that quiet hush. You know, you do the little quiet walks, and you blow their minds, and then you tell them the story. It's the cognitive that goes on top of that. And that's how culture works. It starts in the body, right? When we talk about understanding, when we talk about making belief a real thing, it doesn't start in the mind. It starts in the body. And so storytelling honors that, because if you don't have that mood down, the story's lost. If you don't understand how to set rhythm and set tone, then what you say does not matter. And we've seen this time and time again. I'm sure you know of a TED talk that fell flat, and it was really fascinating, but the guy they just didn't have the rhythm. They just didn't have that little piece of oomph that just says, you're speaking to me. And it wasn't that they weren't presentable or articulate or intelligent. It was just the way that they presented the information. And so when we talk about culture, when we talk about this inside of businesses, I use stories as an illustrator because it helps people feel emotion. It helps people understand exactly what someone's going through. You know, if we come up with the story of a situation to say, like, man, let's imagine for one moment what the CEO does every morning, who lives in upstate New York and is remote for his company, and how that's different from a kid who's living in the Bronx and maybe is an intern. Let's imagine for 1 second what it means to wake up in their different worlds. Let's think about what they get for coffee. Let's think about where they go to eat breakfast or lunch. Let's think about if they even have lunch. Let's think about how comfortable their bed is. Let's think about what their parents are like. And let's create a story in which each person in that scenario is the main character. And we're giving them the due respect that we would all want if somebody were focusing on our own story. But that helps us understand from a somatic, from a personal bodied level, a level of intelligence that sometimes we ignore when it comes to culture work. Because we'll focus so much on what we can think, what's in the framework, where it's like, well, she's not drinking soda because she runs marathons and she believes not in using high fructose corn syrup. That's not going to pop up on her resume, but it absolutely is apparent through her LinkedIn post. If she keeps posting about running and eating healthy, we can assume that she's not going to want soda, right? That's where I think storytelling is actually the biggest blessing in the situation, is because as humans, we can drop ourselves into stories, right? This is what we see through film, through music, through art, is the ability to be transported into a moment through our nervous systems and our minds. And so if we can do that intentionally with culture work, we can empathize at a higher level, right? We can optimize our environments better because now we can understand the weight that people carry when they show up in spaces. And we can even understand the perspectives and how deep rooted those perspectives may be.
Quick question. Well, it's going to take you someplace else. You're so good at being an ambassador of those avatars, those examples that you've just shared, the kid in the Bronx, the man upstate. Do you work to bring those people together so they can maybe rub elbows and chat and elevate and expose them to thinking and having a conversation?
Well, that's where the cultural leadership and cultural intelligence really gets into the teaching side of it, right? I have to accept that not every person wants to have their world shaken up like a snow globe, right? Then that's just the reality of the situation. And I'm not trying to do that to everyone. You force somebody through a tough encounter like that, especially where you're going to have them question what makes them who they are, where they come from, the history that they may have tried to forget, especially with the history of our country. It's a very tough conversation to have, and I don't hold any animosity even in those who go, no, I'm good. I don't really want to dive into that, because trust me, if someone had presented me with a choice at the beginning of this, I can't say that I would have done the same dive. But here we are. And so really it's when we know that we can use that gathering to make change. One of the things that we really focus on is that impact. What comes out of this on a psychological, on a physical level? If we know that we want to solve a social issue, then we need to have representative of the community in which that social issue is taking part. The same way that if we want to understand branding, we need to have an understanding of all the stakeholders who are involved in that situation, whether they be frontline employees, board members, it doesn't matter, right? And so in those situations, we bring people together with intention, where we say, we understand your streams don't cross naturally, and we're not saying that they should, because this is life and this is how things work. But in this moment, we need to cross your streams. We need to have a full Ghostbusters moment. And this is how we're going to save the world. And what comes out of that is usually something that transcends generational boundaries. We find key truths. We find things that can be felt in the body that resonate from 13 years old to 84 years old. And when you build on top of that, then you can build something that can last for even longer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I love that. And I'd love to go on and on, but we do have a time constraint and need to land this plane. And so first of all, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and go through these really fascinating insights. And before we go, I want to ask you if there's anything that you want to leave with our audience, any final thoughts, reflections, or resources they should go and find.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things come to mind. Number one, shared perception is the greatest teacher. And if you want to really dive deep into culture, you have to understand your own perspective first and then explore as many others. I think a lot of times when we talk about this word and we use giant SAT and ACT words that like contextualization, it can feel so serious and that only a few people can do it. Anyone can take part in this work as long as you're willing to understand that everybody brings something to the table. Now, for those who are curious, you want to learn more about cultural physics, feel free to find me online. I'm on LinkedIn a lot and on Substack. you can follow me. And this summer, we're going to be doing a cultural summer session to begin teaching and helping to train culturally intelligent leaders to understand this work and help them pass it forward. So if people are interested in that, they can find me on LinkedIn at Evante Daniels, and feel free to reach out.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all these insights with our audience and with us. It's been really inspiring and informative for me, that's for sure. So yes, I encourage everybody to go and find Evante on LinkedIn, check out his work, and definitely check out that summer session if that's something you're able to do. And I also want to remind our listeners, to go and find this podcast, to leave a review wherever you find your podcast, because that really drives the word of mouth, and we want as many people to benefit from this kind of wisdom and insights that we just got today. And if you all are interested in learning how to tell your own story through the narrative methodology, through me and Julienne, you certainly can do so by going to narrative.com, NARATIV.com. We've got a special discount for our listeners right now, 25% on our latest online course, which is completely self-paced and asynchronous, so you can do it anytime on demand, just like almost everything we consume these days. So there you go. That's available. That's on our website. And yeah, if there's anything that you want to bring to us listeners, please do so. We're always ready to listen to you. So thank you so much. Thanks again, Julienne, for being my co-host today.
Thanks. And thank you, Evante. Wonderful.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.